So in the way that a writer ponders the book they want to write, I was most curious and felt that I could sweat blood if I asked myself and the reader, what makes for a moral being? And what makes you act to assert yourself as a moral being? So what appealed to me about Lu Chang, I call him an ordinary man, which really by Chinese parlance is really almost, it's not like we think in the West of an ordinary person. An ordinary man might, Lu Chang might feel wounded that because it carries some sort of negative idea, but he was ordinary. He's a bus mechanic. He lives in Liuyang. He's not an intellectual. So what makes him go to Beijing and then undertake that defiant act? So I was curious, what is it something that we have in ourselves? Is it learned? Is it taught? How do we have this sense of that the world should have some moral clarity and moral order, and what makes us act to assert that? All right, so it seems to me I'm doing a simple story of human interest, but of course it's set in the paradox that is China. So what does it say that to research this story, I go to China and I have to go in skulking around? I can set up no meeting openly. Every meeting must be clandestine. I follow advice from everybody that I can before I leave Canada. I don't get in touch with the Human Rights Network. I don't get in touch with any of the network of dissidents because it's a year before the Olympic Games, and I know that they are under stronger surveillance and monitoring, and in fact are probably rounded up. So I go in under the radar. I follow advice like setting up meetings with spy-like precautions. More than once, my code to meet someone was when I would don a certain baseball cap and I'd wait for somebody to come forward because I was told you don't use a cell phone. Even when it's off, a cell phone is like a tracking device. So when I go back to my hotel room, I know that I'm warned, of course, that I'm a foreigner. I'm sure it's surely that I'm under surveillance. Surely there are surveillance cameras in the hotel room. I have to arrange, I have in my hip pocket, sure I have my Canadian passport, but I have to arrange in my hip pocket a letter from a university giving me a cover of another research project, which I actually undertake, so that if I am detained, I've got some argument to justify my presence in China. So I did do my research, talking to people who I then subsequently tried to protect by not naming them. Perhaps my most anxious moment was in hiring interpreters. I speak only a smattering of Chinese. I can hardly read or write. So my most ethically difficult moment was to hire my interpreters, who, of course, everyone I did hire, I never told them what I was up to until it was too late for them to turn back, because I was worried about endangering them. So that didn't stop me, however, from doing also the legwork in China. So, for example, I go down to the Liuyang River. I walk onto the sandbanks of the river where Lu Chang, when he's a young boy, would push to the front of the crowd so he could, with the little kids, would be allowed to stand in front to watch a prisoner being executed. I climbed up the steep riverbank where Lu Chang is a boy of 12 or 13, and he climbs out of the river and his shorts are all dripping wet and he's full of the joy of a boy's life. He takes the inner tube and he goes back home and he realizes too late that the radio is broadcasting the Chairman Mao's death. And it comes back to haunt him 2 decades later, almost at his trial, when they say, "You didn't cry when the chairman died. You have no love for the chairman. You've been a reactionary from the beginning." And I walked the back alleys of Liuyang, where there was a wall where one of Liuyang's classmates wrote something about against Mao, and Lu Decheng's classmate is sentenced to 15 years in prison. Other back alleys where Lu Decheng, a teenage boy, falls in love with a teenage girl. They live together. They have a child. They're pregnant. They want to have the child. I walk these alleyways where the neighborhood busybodies, the family planning people, hounded the two for illegally living together, for being pregnant without first having permission and having the child family planning certificate, and then for having the baby and therefore having a non-child. So when I came across all these facets of Lu Decheng's story, that was when it took me back to my question, what makes for a moral being? That I understood that the most basic of human instincts, to love, running away with his teenage love, having a child on his own terms, wanting to marry on his own terms, that most basic instinct, why even the state would repress that and trample on those rights. So that's when I thought to myself, all right, as a writer, now I really want, this is where I'm headed, and this is what I want to get at. Not just the rights part of human rights, which I feel is documented, but the human part of human rights. I go back to the gentleman in the business lounge that said so elatedly to his fellow executive that he'd found the person to talk China. Well, I've heard Western journalists say about Lu Decheng, Yu Zhejian, and Yu Dongyue, the three men from Hunan, that what they did to deface Mao's portrait was a reckless act, futile. What had they gained? Sentenced to life in prison, 20 years, 16 years. They'd paid a huge personal cost. To what end? Did they regret it? Well, in the reception to my book, I've also had it said that, well, these three young men, they're extraordinary. That it's rare to find somebody with that kind of moral conscience. Well, I want to ask, to talk China. My question is, when I go back to that very basic instinct to love and to assert your right to love, is it so rare, is it so uncommon to have a moral conscience and to stand up for what you desire and want and just to be? Is it so rare? So that businessman dialing on the phone for someone to talk China, really it's all of us, every one of us, talking about what is so important and vitally important of human rights and the human side of human rights in China.